it's a very hard thing for people to understand that if you're monolingual and you're monocultural, it's very hard for you to imagine how amazing the world looks when you're culturally diverse, when you have multiple abilities to view people from different perspectives. I have to tell you a story. So what happened was I had been struggling to make this film because I really believed in the fact that the world was changing at that point, and I believed that my cultural paradigm was relevant and was giving a fresh view to what it meant to be a British filmmaker. And I'd written this script that was very British, but also very international, because it was about the diaspora. She's Indian, but she could be Greek, Chinese, Greek, Australian, Chinese, American. She could be any of those things. So the culture of the diaspora was something to me that was very palpable. Studios will call that now international, films that are international, that cross over. That's their terminology. But for me at the time, I felt in my heart those human stories we all connect with. And that's what Bendit was. It was a kind of forerunner for that way of thinking. And then everyone passed, of course, Channel 4, BBC, everyone passed on the film. People just couldn't understand why anyone would want to see a film about football with a girl in it, and then an Indian girl. And then we had at that time the UK, before the UK Film Council, we had the lottery, where you had a committee that was administrating National Lottery finance, and if you submitted your script, a reader would read the script and then recommend whether your project should be financed or not. And I had submitted my script, and one of the producers on that panel gave me the heads up to say, sadly, my film was going to get rejected. And at this point, I was so furious. I just was really, really mad. And I went down to the Film Council, and John Woodward was about to take over. And I went into his office, and I said, I'm furious, because when you guys all want to do panels about how hard it is to make films in Britain, particularly if you're a person of color, you wheel me on to all these platforms to talk about it. But now you're not backing me. You have to back me, because I have a vision. And the reason the reporter said the film wasn't going to get backed is because he said they'll never be able to find an Indian girl who can bend a ball like David Beckham. And that was the main reason to reject the film. And I shouted to them, I said, does this man think Harrison Ford jumps out of helicopters? So I told Harrison Ford that story last night. And he said, well, thank you. I'm so glad that I was able to help you with your career. And he said, and by the way, I do fucking jump out of helicopters. But that was sweet. And then, of course, John Woodward, credit to him. He went back and he said to the committee, whatever you do, you have to pass this film. And so the committee passed the film. So I got my first $1 million. And then after that, I got the rest of the money. And then that's the only reason that film got made.
But do you think...
Thank you. But
it's sort of like...
But it's relevant to today,
yeah.
Especially whoever was in the last panel, The thing that you have to take away from the last panel is when Al, I think it is, who said, we don't know anything. We don't know anything. We don't know what's going to be a hit. We have no idea, And to me, part of that is about the currency of content and the fact that people are bored with the same old, but fearful about crossing cultural paths that can inject some freshness and new stories. So personally, I'm been relatively successful. I'm still able to make great films, and I was very happy with my Bruce Springsteen film, and every filmmaker should have one of those bidding wars at Sundance. I mean, it was an amazing thing. So even if I never make another film, I was just so happy with that. But the thing is that we need fresh ideas. And it's a very hard thing for people to understand that if you're monolingual and you're monocultural, you know, it's very hard for you to imagine how amazing the world looks when you're culturally diverse, when you have multiple abilities to view people from different perspectives. I mean, one of the things I always found so funny when I was young was when Richard Pryor and Eddie Murphy would play English people or American people. It was really funny. It was a great perspective. And I think people don't think that we can necessarily make films about people who don't look like us, you know, or create those stories when we can. But what we do is inject a freshness and a different perspective. And I feel if the industry would wholeheartedly embrace that, there would be, people would come back to the cinema because it would be relevant. Yeah. And I think the reason Bend It Like Beckham was such a big hit around the world at that time, and by the way, it has a statistic that no other film in the whole world has. It's the only film that has been distributed in every single country in the world, including North Korea.
Oh, wow.
It's the only film. And thank you. And that's because it hit on a human essence story, you know, that was coming from familiarity and not familiarity. But it came out just after 9/11. And I made it before 9/11, but it was released after 9/11. And just like the way the world was shaken, you know, with COVID, the world was going through something else at that time. And here was this very sweet, innocent film about tolerance and family and love, actually. And I think the world just went, oh, that's what we need right now. And I think if the film came out today, I'm not sure it would have the same reaction around the world, you know, but at the time it was allowed to fly because the world wanted it, and we got it made. And I feel there are so many more stories like that, ready for people to see in cinemas, but they can't get past the gatekeepers.
So how's, I mean, that was going to be my next question. I mean, Bend It Like Beckham, from people that you were speaking to, talents, other voices, other young voices out there, do you get a sense that the needle has moved at all, or is it still the same? You know, is it still the same problems that you just mentioned?
I think people are looking to try and find that content, find those films that will, you know, be those hits, but you can't do it with formulas, you know. Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is an industry about vision, you know, whether it's commercial vision or creative vision. It is about vision, and you have, you know, it's a business. But within that business, you need to have vision, you need to have a POV, and you need to work with other people who recognize that POV and are able to encourage it. That's what makes it so amazing. That's why we love cinema, because we're transported into other people's worlds and we go, oh my God, they're just like me, kind of thing. Or the thrill of, you know, the thrill of seeing a story that, the underdog story, or a romantic story, or a coming-of-age story, or even an action story, or even a really smart horror film, you know, like Get Out. You know, everything is about shining a light to our world, and it's people of vision who are the most important currency in our cinema. And when you sit and talk about numbers and you know, try and figure it all out like that, yes, there's some currency to that, but you have to allow for the magic. You know, that's the thing. The thing that I do is magic, you know, and I don't know why sometimes something is a hit or not. All I know is that I'm able to tell stories that touch other people, you know, and that are told from a perspective that nobody else could tell. No one else could do the films that I make, and nobody else necessarily wants to make the films that I'm developing or that I want to make. Although now it's different because I'm doing the Disney film.
I
Yeah.
was going to ask about that. Let's talk about that quickly. Before we talk about that, I wanted to just quickly go back to when you're talking about, gatekeepers and people being accepting of new voices and taking risks and it not being down to formulas. How much do you think the industry's changing so fast, so quickly? How much do you feel like the streamers, since they've kind of come into the game, have opened up a possibility for more diverse stories? What is their role in that? Do you think they've kind of helped accelerate it?
Well, I think that's a really interesting question, because I think when the streamers first came, I think there was the sort of democratization in some ways, and they set up these satellites all over the world to create local content, and you had sort of breakouts, a few breakout stories, which is great because you've got people now watching foreign language content, but I think that as we're seeing in the industry, the streaming model cannot sustain independent filmmaking, and so we are going to need to go back to the magic. We're going to need to be able to invest in and create films that stand above the parapet, whether that's on a streaming platform, whether that's, in theaters. The Oscar winner of last year is an example, of something being different and people getting behind it and championing it, whether you like the film or not. The most amazing thing was it was audacious. It was a completely audacious. So the success of the film and Michelle's win, is tantamount to what I'm saying. People want different stories, interesting stories that reflect our world today. And partly the streaming thing is also about homogenization as well. So long as there's room to have those different stories, it'd be interesting to see how independent film develops in the next few years. That's really what we really need. And I know the BFI, I work with the BFI quite a lot in Britain, and there are talks to find ways to work with exhibitors and cinemas to encourage more independent film exhibition, British film exhibition. And I think it's those sort of endeavors, where governments assist with distributors and exhibitors to find ways to promote local cinema and those films. The French do it very well, definitely, but so those films are allowed to breathe, as well as all the lovely big, Tom Cruise movies. There's obviously audiences for that, but also audiences for people who want to be touched and moved by cinema.